What happens when the most feared crime boss in Philadelphia tries to break the one woman who refuses to be afraid of him? He thought she would fold like everyone else. Instead, the full-figured bookkeeper nobody bothered to notice brought the whole empire to its knees. This is a story about being underestimated, about cruelty, and about the kind of revenge that doesn't need a gun. It starts on a slow Wednesday in the back office of a supper club, where the wine was overpriced, and the truth was kept off the books. Bernadette Calloway had a gift for being invisible, and she had spent 29 years sharpening it into a profession. She was the bookkeeper at Ember and Oak, a steakhouse on the edge of the old Italian quarter, where the leather booths were the color of dried blood, and the lighting was kept low enough that the regulars never had to look each other in the eye. Bernadette, Birdie, to the handful of people who liked her, did the math that kept the place breathing. Real numbers in one ledger, the other numbers in a second one she never spoke about out loud. She had figured out within her first week that Ember and Oak only pretended to be a restaurant. What it actually was, she learned to write around. She was a big woman, soft through the middle and wide at the hip, and she'd made peace with the fact that most people decided who she was before she opened her mouth. She wore plain cardigans buttoned to the throat. She kept her dark hair pinned back. She moved through the dining room like a shadow that knew how to carry a tray, smiling at nobody, asking for nothing. It was easier that way. When you took up the kind of space the world had already decided was too much, the smartest thing to do was give it less of you to look at. The trouble started the night Damiano Conti decided to look. Everyone in the building knew the Conti name. Damiano Conti was the head of the Conti family. The man the newspapers called a real estate developer, and the men in the back booths called the Crow, because he sat in the dark, said nothing, and you only noticed him once it was too late. He owned Ember and Oak the way he owned half the riverfront, quietly and completely, through paperwork so clean it squeaked. He came in maybe twice a month. When he came, the air changed. Waiters dropped things. The manager, a sweating ox of a man named Walt Pearson, started double-checking the silverware like his life depended on the fold of a napkin. That Wednesday, Walt grabbed Birdie's arm in the hallway hard enough to leave a mark. "He wants the books brought to the floor," Walt hissed. His upper lip was wet. "Tonight. To his table. You don't talk. You don't look at him. You set them down. You leave. You hearing me?" "I always hear you, Walt." Birdie pried his fingers off her sleeve one at a time. "You're squeezing me like a melon you can't afford." She gathered the clean ledger, the one with the lies that balanced, and carried it out into the dining room. Damiano was in the far corner booth, back to the wall, the way men like him always sat. He had black hair going silver at the temples, a face all sharp angles and patience, and a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Birdie's car and her rent put together. Two of his men flanked the table, a heavy-set bull named Bruno with a flat, watchful stare, and a leaner one called Tomas who never stopped chewing gum. Damiano didn't look up when she set the ledger down. He looked at his wine. "You're the one who does my arithmetic," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that never had to be loud because everyone was already listening. "I pictured someone else." "People usually do," Birdie said and turned to go. "I wasn't finished." She stopped. She didn't turn back all the way, just enough. Now he looked at her, and he took his time about it, dragging his eyes from her sensible shoes up the wide line of her hips to the cardigan buttoned at her throat, and the corner of his mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. He said it loud enough for the three nearest tables to hear, which she understood at once was the point. "Tell me," he said, "when the numbers come out wrong, do you eat the difference? Because from the look of you, sweetheart, the difference has been substantial." Thomas snorted. Bruno's mouth twitched. At the next table, a man pretended very hard to study his menu. There was a particular silence that fell after a thing like that. Birdie knew it well, had lived inside it since she was 12 years old, the silence of a room waiting to see if the fat girl would cry. Most of her life she'd given them the cry, because it was faster. But she was tired tonight, and the casual ease of his cruelty. This powerful, polished man wasting his cruelty on a woman bringing him a book, lit something cold and clean in her chest, a small flame with no smoke. She didn't flush, she didn't stammer. She reached down, picked up the ledger she'd just set in front of him, and tucked it back under her arm. "What are you doing?" Damiano said. "Taking my arithmetic back to the office, Mr. Conti." Her voice was pleasant, almost kind. "A man who can't get through a hello without insulting the help isn't a man I trust to read my columns straight. You'll mistake your own losses for my mistakes, and then we'll both be unhappy. I'll send Walt out with a copy he can't argue with. The booth went still. Bruno's hand drifted toward his jacket. Tomas stopped chewing. Damiano set down his wine. He stood slow, unfolding to his full height, and stepped close to her. Close enough that she could smell him, cedar and cold leather and something underneath it like struck metal. He was a head taller. He used it. Do you have any idea, he said softly, who you're speaking to? Birdie tipped her chin up. Her heart was slamming so hard she was sure he could hear it. But her face stayed flat as a cutting board. A man who owns a steakhouse and apparently can't get anyone to like him in it, she said. You want to scare me, you'll have to get in line behind my landlord, now. You want the books or not? Because I have a closing to run and you have a steak getting cold. For 5 seconds, nobody breathed. A muscle moved along Damiano's jaw. He was a man the whole city stepped around, and a woman in a buttoned cardigan was looking at him like he was a clog in a sink. Then the strangest thing happened. He laughed, low, quiet, surprised out of him like a cough. He sat back down and waved Bruno's hand away from the gun. Leave the book, he said, and send out whatever the kitchen's proud of tonight. On my tab, for her. I don't take charity from people who call me a difference, Birdie said, and set the ledger down with a flat final clap that made the silverware jump. She walked away. She felt his eyes follow her the whole length of the floor, tracking the heavy sway of her, and she made herself walk slow, the way she'd taught herself never to do, just to prove she could. She made it through the kitchen doors before her knees gave. She caught the steel prep counter and stood there shaking, gulping air that tasted like garlic and bleach.
Are you out of your mind?
Walt whispered, materializing beside her, grey as a corpse.
Do you know what he does to people?
Bookkeeping mostly, Birdie managed. I do his bookkeeping, but she knew what she'd done. She'd made herself visible. After a lifetime of disappearing, she'd stood in the light and dared the most dangerous man in the city to look. And he had. When Damiano left that night, the busser found something tucked under his empty glass. a $100 bill, crisp as a blade, and on a cocktail napkin, in handwriting like wrought iron, a single line. You've got a sharp tongue for a quiet little mouse. I'm going to enjoy watching you learn when to use it. What followed was 2 weeks of the strangest war Birdie had ever fought, and the strangest part was that she started to enjoy it. Damiano did not have her quietly disappeared, which she half expected. Instead, he turned up. He started coming to Ember and Oak 3-4 nights a week, always to the corner booth, always asking that the bookkeeper bring his check personally. He made small, surgical remarks. He'd ask, loud enough to carry, whether the kitchen could spare the inventory to feed her after her shift. He left her tips that weren't money, a gym pamphlet once, a salad menu from a place across town with a circle drawn around the lowest calorie item. Birdie did not break, she volleyed. When he left the gym pamphlet, she had a $50 donation made to the Philadelphia Animal Shelter in the name of Damiano Conti for the rescue of stray and unwanted creatures, and taped the thank you certificate to the underside of his reserved table, where only he would find it. When he complained the booth seemed cramped, she offered, with enormous concern, to bring him a phone book to sit on so he could feel taller. When he asked the waiter, smirking, whether she'd left him any of the bread, she sent out a single breadstick on a silver plate with a note. Rationed per your dietary advice. You're welcome. The dining room started watching for it. The waiters placed bets, and Damiano Conti, a man who had not been told no in a decade, sat in his dark corner and was slowly, helplessly fascinated. Because here was the thing nobody understood about him, the thing he barely understood himself. Everyone in his world lied to him. They bowed, they flattered. Beautiful women, slim and bright and interchangeable, threw themselves across his path like rugs to be walked on. And this round, unbothered woman with ink on her fingers looked at him with nothing in her eyes but a low, steady contempt, and it drove him out of his mind. He wanted to crack her open. He wanted to find the thing inside her that everyone else had, the fear, the wanting, and he kept not finding it. Birdie, for her part, told herself it was just survival. She was good at reading dangerous men. It was practically the job. But there were nights she caught herself sharpening a comeback in the shower, grinning at the tile, and she had the uncomfortable suspicion she'd started to look forward to him. She couldn't quit. That was the other truth she kept in the second ledger of her life. Her grandmother Loretta had raised her, and Loretta was in a memory care home in the Northeast that cost more every month than Birdie made in 2. And the difference Birdie made up with overtime, with the off-books consulting. Walt slid her in cash, with skipping her own dentist, with a winter coat held together by safety pins. She needed Ember and Oak, So she swallowed the fear, and she fought the only way a woman with no power ever can. She refused to flinch. The war stopped being funny on a cold Thursday in February, after the dinner rush had bled out and the place was nearly empty. Birdie was up front reconciling the register while Walt counted the safe in back. The front door opened and it wasn't Damiano. It was two men she'd never seen, big through the shoulders, with the kind of knuckles that had a history. The shorter one had a scar splitting his eyebrow. They tracked melting snow across the carpet and didn't bother to wipe their boots. "Where's Pearson?" the scarred one said. His accent had a brogue under it. Cold dread settled in Birdie's stomach. "We're closed," she said, stepping out from behind the host stand, putting herself between them and the hallway to the office. "Kitchen's down. You'll want to come back. Shut your mouth, love." The taller one looked her over with open disgust. "We know he's back there. Tell him Brennan wants his envelope. He's 3 months late. Brennan." The name landed in Birdie's gut like a swallowed stone. The Brennans ran the river wards, and this was Conti ground, every inch of it. If the Brennans were sending collectors into a Conti room, then something had cracked open under the whole city, and she was standing in the middle of it holding a register tape. "I said we're closed," Birdie repeated, and she did not move. The taller one, Ronan, the scarred one would call him in a second, loved, an ugly grating sound. "Would you look at the size of it," he said. "Thinks it's a door." He stepped in and shoved her hard in the chest with the flat of his hand. Birdie went back into the bus's station and a tray of glasses came down with her, exploding across the tile, slicing a long stripe up her forearm. The pain was a bright, distant thing. Adrenaline ate it. "Don't," she said, and her hand closed on the neck of a wine bottle on the station shelf. "Touch me again and I will open you up like a Sunday paper." The scarred one, Fergus, pulled a folding knife from his coat and came at her. He never got there. The front door of ember and oak blew inward off one hinge. Damiano Conti stood in the broken frame, his black coat dusted with snow, his face a flat and terrible calm. Bruno and Thomas were a half step behind him, and their guns were already up and steady. "Drop it, Fergus," Damiano said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. It went through the room like a wire through soft cheese. The Brennan men froze. They knew that voice. Everyone on the river knew that voice. "This isn't your fight, Conti," Ronan said, hands rising slow. "Brennan owns this block now. Pearson's into us. Brennan doesn't own the snow on my boots," Damiano said, and walked in unhurried, and he still hadn't looked at Birdie once, but the whole shape of him had turned protective, a wall sliding into place. "And nobody," he said, "walks into my house and lays a hand on what's mine." Birdie's jaw tightened around the words "what's mine." She wasn't his, she wasn't anybody's. She filed it away to throw at him later, if there was a later. Then Damiano moved, and for a big man in a tailored coat he moved like something that had practiced it in the dark. He crossed to Fergus in 2 strides. He didn't draw a gun. He caught the man's knife wrist and twisted until something gave with a wet, sickening pop, and as Fergus screamed and the knife hit the carpet, Damiano drove a knee up into his face and the screaming stopped. Fergus folded to the floor and did not get up. Ronan grabbed for his coat and Bruno was already there, the barrel of a long suppressor pressed cold to his temple. "Take your garbage," Damiano said to Ronan, plucking a fleck of blood off his cuff with 2 fingers like it offended him. "And tell Cormac Brennan that the next time he sends his dogs onto my ground, I'll send them home in pieces small enough to mail." "Go!" hauled his brother up by the collar and dragged him bleeding out into the snow. The room rang with quiet. Damiano turned finally and looked at her. Birdie stood against the wall, breathing in ragged pulls, a thread of red running down her forearm to drip off her fingertips. Her cardigan was torn at the shoulder. Her hair had come loose. He crossed the room slow, his dark eyes locked on hers, and stopped close enough that she could feel the cold coming off his coat. He reached out, his gloved hand came up and with a gentleness that made no sense from a man who had just broken another man's face, touched the cut on her forearm. "You're bleeding," he said. "I noticed." She pulled her arm back. She hated that her voice shook. "I had it handled." The softness went out of his eyes like a light switched off, replaced by the old arrogance. He leaned in, his mouth near her ear. "You were about to be opened up by Brennan trash," he said, dark and low. "I just saved your life. Most people would be on the floor thanking me by now." He drew back and looked down at her, mocking, expectant. "Go ahead, say it. Tell me you're grateful." Birdie looked at this beautiful, frightening man who thought he could buy her gratitude with violence, the same way he'd tried to buy her silence with cruelty. She still had the taste of copper in her mouth from biting her lip when she fell. and she looked him dead in the eye and said, "I don't thank men who think rescuing me makes them my owner. You didn't save my life, Mr. Conti. You saved your bookkeeper. There's a difference. You taught me about differences, remember?" A muscle feathered in his jaw. He didn't strike her. He didn't shout. Something moved behind his eyes instead, something deep and hungry that frightened her far more than his anger would have. He stepped back. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, and what he saw seemed to rearrange something in his chest. "We'll see," he said quietly, and turned and walked out into the white. The following Monday, Walt Pearson was gone. In his place stood a lawyer in a slim grey suit named Royce, who informed the staff, smiling, that Ember and Oak had been brought fully in-house under Conti Holdings effective immediately, and that all positions were secure for those who understood the value of discretion. Birdie's stomach dropped through the floor. Damiano hadn't just escalated their little war. He had brought the whole battlefield out from under her, and yet the torment stopped. Cold turkey. No more pamphlets, no more loud remarks. Instead, Damiano simply came in, sat in his corner booth and watched her work. His eyes followed her across the floor. The confident way she moved now that she'd stopped pretending to take up less room. The easy way she carried a loaded tray that made the busboys wince. The set of her shoulders when she leaned over a table. The silence was worse than the insults. It was the patience of something that had decided it wanted you and was simply waiting to learn the lock. But Birdie's refusal to break in front of those Brennan men had traveled farther than the four walls of the steakhouse. Cormac Brennan, head of the River Wards, did not forgive a broken wrist on his own crew. Damiano had drawn first blood, and Cormac wanted it back with interest, and word had begun to move through the dark parts of the city. Carried by men who owed both families, whispered by a crooked councilman named Royce's cousin in the zoning office, that the untouchable Crow had developed one inexplicable soft spot. A round, loud-mouthed bookkeeper from a steakhouse in the old quarter. They decided to cut him where they thought he couldn't bleed. It happened on a freezing night 2 weeks later, in the narrow stairwell of Birdie's walk-up on Tasker Street, the one with the radiator that had been broken since Thanksgiving. She'd just gotten the key in the door when the hallway bulb died. Not flickered, died smashed dark, and a hand the size of a dinner plate clamped over her mouth, smelling of cigarettes and machine oil. Not a sound, fat girl. A voice breathed in her ear. A second man shoved the door open and pushed her inside, into the cold dark of her own apartment. It was Ronan Brennan, his brother's cast still on his hand, and a hulking stranger she didn't know. Fear seized her chest and tried to close her throat. She forced it down. 29 years of being targeted for her size had taught her one thing she could lean on like a wall. She was not small. She had never been small. And she would be damned if she'd let these men make her act like it. "Conti's gonna find what's left of you," Ronan sneered, dragging a revolver from his waistband. "And then we'll do him too." He shoved her hard toward the center of the room, expecting her to stumble and go down. He badly misjudged her center of gravity. Birdie planted her feet, wide stance, low hips, the body the world had spent a lifetime mocking, and absorbed the shove without giving an inch. Then she used the momentums, spinning and swung the heavy canvas bag off her shoulder with everything she had. The brass buckle caught Ronan across the temple with a crack like a dropped plate. He dropped the gun, howling, and stumbled into the wall. The second man lunged and got his arms around her wide waist, trying to take her to the floor. Birdie made a sound she'd never made before, a roar that came up from somewhere under her ribs, and she threw all of herself backward, slamming him into the plaster. The wall cracked. The air left him in a wheeze. She was not a flower to be plucked. She was a landslide, and she had finally stopped apologizing for it. She drove an elbow into his ribs, but Ronan had found his feet. He grabbed the floor lamp and swung it. The base caught her across the shoulder and pain detonated down her arm, dropping her to her knees on the cold linoleum. Her vision swam. She heard Ronan rack the slide and felt the muzzle press cold against her forehead. "Clever trick, sweetheart," he panted, blood sheeting down his face. "Say goodnight." The gunshot in that small room was the loudest thing she had ever heard. But the pain never came. Ronan's eyes rolled back and he folded onto her floor in a heap that did not move again. Damiano Conti stood in her doorway. His coat was torn. The left side of his white shirt was going dark and wet fast. There was a suppressed pistol in his hand and smoke curling off the barrel, and he was alone. Bruno and Thomas nowhere, ambushed somewhere below in the dark. The second man saw the boss himself bleeding and made the worst decision of his life. He pulled a blade and charged. Damiano raised the gun, but the bullet already in his side had slowed him, and the man hit him and drove them both into the cramped hallway. The gun skidded out of reach. The man got the knife up, aiming for Damiano's throat. "Hey!" Birdie bellowed. She didn't look for a weapon. She made herself one. She came off the floor and across the room with a speed nobody who had ever called her slow would have believed, and she hit the man with the full, devastating weight of her shoulder, lifting him clean off Damiano and carrying him backward into the dead cast-iron radiator under the window. The old pipe groaned and snapped at the joint. A jet of scalding steam blasted out and caught the man across the face. He screamed, clawing blind for the door, and went down the stairs 3 at a time into the night. The apartment fell silent except for the hiss of the broken pipe and 2 people breathing hard. Birdie pushed herself upright, her shoulder a screaming knot, her shirt torn, her arm bleeding again. She looked down at the most feared man in the city, slumped against her water-stained wall, one hand pressed to his side, his skin gone grey, the arrogance entirely gone from his face. "You!" Damiano rasped, staring up at her like she was something he'd never seen before. "You just saved your life," Birdie finished, already grabbing the dish towel off the oven handle and dropping to her knees beside him, pressing it hard into the wound. "Yeah. Let's see one of your skinny supermodels carry your dead weight down 4 flights before the neighbors call the cops." She got an arm under him and hauled. He was dense, all arm around his back, and braced him against her own wide, solid hip, and for the first time in his life, Damiano Conti leaned his entire weight on another human being and let himself be held up. His safe house was a penthouse high over the river, all glass and pale stone and silence. Birdie got him into the private elevator just as he passed out from the blood loss. Bruno and Tomas turned up 20 minutes later, bloodied themselves, with a doctor who worked for cash and asked no questions and went to the grim business of digging a Brennan bullet out of the boss's ribs. Birdie sat in the enormous dim living room with her ruined coat thrown over the arm of a leather couch that cost more than her grandmother's care for a year. She was wrecked, bruised, bleeding through a bandage one of the men had taped on, smeared with blood that was half hers and half his. She should have run. She had a cousin in Pittsburgh and bus fare in her sock drawer, but something kept her anchored to that couch, and she was honest enough with herself to know it wasn't only the question of whether he'd live. 2 hours later, the bedroom door opened. Damiano stood in it, bare-chested, his torso wrapped tight in white, wearing only dark slacks, stripped of the suit and the silence and the armor. He looked younger, he looked human. He crossed the room slowly, wincing at each step, and stopped in front of where she sat. "The doctor says I lost a lot of blood," he said. His voice was rougher and quieter than she had ever heard it. "He says if you hadn't held pressure on it, if you hadn't gotten me down those stairs, I'd have bled out on that ugly floor of yours. I'll bill you for the towel," Birdie said, "and the radiator." He didn't laugh. He looked down at her, and his eyes moved over her the way they always did, but everything behind them had changed. The wide, soft swell of her, the thick arms that had thrown a grown man through a wall, the round face that had never once given him the fear he kept fishing for. The mockery was gone. What replaced it looked, alarmingly, like reverence. "Why?" he said. "Why did you fight for me? I've been nothing to you but a cruelty. I humiliated you in my own dining room. I bought the place out from under your feet, because I don't let bullies win." Birdie's voice was steady, though her hands were not. "Not Brennan's men, not you. You think power's about how small you can make somebody feel. You looked at me and saw a punchline because I don't fit in your tailored little world, so I fought. That's the whole answer. It was never about you." He came closer. She could feel the fever heat coming off his bare skin. "I didn't go after you because you don't fit in," Damiano said, and the words came out of him like they hurt, like he was prying them loose against his own will. "I went after you because you're the only real thing I've stood next to in 10 years. Everyone lies to me, Bernadette. They bow, they scrape, they agree before I've finished the sentence, because they're terrified of me. And then you," his breath caught, "you took my ledger off my own table and walked away from me in front of my own men. You looked me in the eye and told me to get in line behind your landlord. You drove me out of my mind. I wanted to break you just to prove you were like all the rest. You wouldn't break. You just got bigger, realer. I couldn't stop looking." He reached up. His rough fingers tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and the gentleness of it after everything sent a confused electric jolt down her spine that she resented with her whole heart. "You're not a punchline," he said. You're the only queen I've ever met who didn't want a crown off me. I was too arrogant to see it until I was the one on the floor, and you were the one standing over me with my blood on your hands." Birdie stood up. They were inches apart, her chest nearly against the bandages over his ribs. She did not melt. She kept her spine like a steel rule. "Words are the cheapest thing you own, Mr. Conti," she said, and her voice had a low authority in it that hadn't been there a month ago, that maybe had always been there waiting. "You told me I ate the difference. You told me to thank you for saving the help. You told me to learn when to use my mouth. You thought you could break a woman's dignity because she wears a bigger size and keeps quiet. So don't tell me you've changed. Show me." His jaw worked. The shame in his eyes was real and total. "I was wrong," he said. "Prove it," she said. The silence stretched out across that vast glass room, heavy and humming. Damiano Conti answered to no one. He bowed to no one. He commanded violent men and moved millions through accounts a woman exactly like her had spent 2 years keeping invisible. He looked into her fierce, tired, beautiful face. And then, slowly, around the searing pain in his side, the most feared man in Philadelphia began to lower himself. He sank down until both knees met the pale stone floor. He knelt at her feet, looking up at the full-figured woman who had taken his cruelty and handed it back sharpened, who had carried him out of death on her own wide and certain hips. He reached forward and took her bruised hands in his, and he pressed his mouth to her scraped knuckles like a man at an altar. "I, Damiano Conti, am on my knees," he said, his voice steady at last, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm sorry, Bernadette. I'm yours. Tell me what you want and it's done." Birdie looked down at the broken king with his pride finally remade in her image, and a slow, victorious warmth spread through her chest, something she had earned the hard way and would never apologize for again. She slid one hand free and cupped his jaw, tilting his face up to hers. "Good," she said softly. "Now get up off my floor, Mr. Conti. You're bleeding on the stone, and we've got a lot to do." She let the smile come, sharp and certain. "Because Cormac Brennan sent men to my home tonight. He put hands on me in my own stairwell. And you and I are going to go through his entire operation together, line by line, until there's nothing left of it to put in a book." Damiano let her pull him to his feet. For the first time in a decade, the crow followed someone else's lead, and he did it gladly. Sometimes the strongest woman in the room is the one the world spent its whole life telling to take up less space. And the smartest thing a powerful man can do is finally get out of her way.